55 meters down in the Baltic Sea, cameras reveal something that shouldn't be forgotten but has been. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff, a massive passenger ship lying on her side in the cold Polish waters. But here's what makes this discovery so haunting. This isn't just another shipwreck. This is the site of the deadliest maritime disaster in human history. Over 9,000 people died when this ship went down on January 30th, 1945. That's 6 times more than the Titanic. 6 times. And almost nobody knows it happened. The Titanic killed 1,517 people and became the most famous shipwreck in history. Books, movies, documentaries. Everyone knows the Titanic, but the Wilhelm Gustloff killed over 9,000, most of them women and children, fleeing the advancing Soviet army, and it's been virtually erased from collective memory. 3 Soviet torpedoes, freezing Baltic water, a ship designed for 1,800 passengers, carrying over 10,000 refugees, and when she went down in less than an hour, she took more lives than any other ship in history. Why don't we know about this? Because the Wilhelm Gustloff was a German ship, because she'd been a Nazi propaganda vessel before the war, because she sank in the chaos of World War II's final months, when nobody was counting civilian casualties on the German side, and because after the war, nobody wanted to talk about it. The Germans were the defeated enemy. The Soviets were heroes who'd beaten the Nazis, and 9,000 dead refugees didn't fit anyone's narrative. For 58 years, the Wilhelm Gustloff rested in the Baltic, a war grave that the world chose to forget. Then in 2003, divers finally documented the wreck, and what they found preserved in the cold Baltic waters was evidence of the greatest loss of life at sea ever recorded. This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the ship that killed 6 times more people than the Titanic, and the tragedy that history tried to erase. The MV Wilhelm Gustloff was launched on May 5, 1937, in Hamburg, Germany. She was 684 feet long, displaced 25,484 tons, and was designed as a cruise ship for the Kraft durch Freude UO Strength Through Joy program, the Nazi leisure organization that provided subsidized vacations for German workers. The idea was propaganda. Show the world that Nazi Germany cared about its workers, that the Reich provided prosperity and happiness for loyal Germans. The Gustloff was beautiful. Art Deco interiors, spacious cabins, swimming pools, dining halls. She could carry 1,465 passengers in comfort, with a crew of 417. She was designed for Mediterranean cruises, for showing German workers the beaches of Italy and the Norwegian fjords. And for 4 years before the war, that's exactly what she did. Over 50 cruises, tens of thousands of passengers, the floating symbol of Nazi social policy. But the Wilhelm Gustloff was never just a cruise ship. She was a propaganda tool from the beginning. Named after Wilhelm Gustloff, a Nazi party official who'd been assassinated in 1936, the ship was meant to embody Nazi ideals. The launch ceremony was attended by Hitler himself. The ship's maiden voyage was a Nazi party event. Every cruise was an opportunity to indoctrinate passengers with Nazi ideology while they enjoyed their subsidized vacation. When World War II began in September 1939, the Gustloff's cruise days ended immediately. The German Navy requisitioned her and converted her to a hospital ship, painted white with red crosses, transporting wounded soldiers from the Eastern Front back to Germany. Then in 1940, she was converted again, this time into a floating barracks for U-boat trainees in Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland. For the next 4 years, the Gustloff sat in port, her luxurious cabins turned into dormitories for submarine crews learning their deadly trade. By late 1944, the war was lost. Everyone knew it, even if nobody in the German high command would admit it publicly. The Soviet Red Army was advancing westward, pushing through Poland toward East Prussia. Millions of German civilians, soldiers' families, Nazi party officials, anyone associated with the Reich, were fleeing westward, trying to escape before the Soviets arrived. The stories coming from the east were terrifying. Mass rapes, executions, revenge for what the Germans had done in Russia. The German Navy began Operation Hannibal in January 1945, the largest sea evacuation in history. Every available ship was pressed into service to evacuate German civilians and military personnel from East Prussia before the Soviet army overran the region. Cargo ships, fishing boats, naval vessels, and passenger liners like the Wilhelm Gustloff, sitting in Gotenhafen, suddenly valuable again as a transport ship. On January 21, 1945, the Gustloff was prepared for her final voyage. The destination was Kiel in western Germany, a journey of about 300 nautical miles across the Baltic Sea. The ship's captain, Friedrich Petersen, was a merchant marine officer with decades of experience, but he'd never commanded a ship in wartime conditions. He'd never sailed through submarine-infested waters with a ship full of refugees. The passengers began boarding on January 27th. The scene at the dock was chaos. Thousands of refugees, desperate to get aboard. Mothers with children. Elderly. Wounded soldiers. Nazi officials and their families cutting to the front of lines. Everyone knew this might be their last chance to escape. The Gustloff was designed for 1,465 passengers. The official manifest would list about 6,600. The actual number was probably over 10,000. Nobody was counting carefully. Nobody was turning people away. They just kept packing them in. The passenger composition tells the story of Germany's collapse. About 4,000 were trained naval personnel, U-boat trainees, and submarine crews being evacuated. About 370 were female naval auxiliaries. About 160 were wounded soldiers. And the rest, probably 5,000 or more, were civilian refugees. Women and children made up the vast majority. Whole families with everything they owned in a single suitcase. Old people who'd lived in East Prussia their entire lives. Babies born during the evacuation. People who had nowhere else to go. The ship was grotesquely overcrowded. Every cabin packed. Every corridor filled. People sleeping on floors, in hallways, on deck, despite the freezing January weather. The lifeboats were frozen solid. The Baltic in January is brutally cold, and nobody had maintained the davits or checked the boats in years. The Gustloff had been a barracks ship, not an active vessel. Safety equipment had degraded, and now she was expected to transport over 10,000 people through waters patrolled by Soviet submarines. On January 30th, 1945, at approximately 12:30 p.m., the Wilhelm Gustloff departed Gotenhafen. She was accompanied by two smaller ships, the torpedo boat Lohe, and another torpedo boat that had to turn back due to mechanical problems. She was supposed to have a destroyer escort through the most dangerous waters, but the destroyer was delayed. Captain Petersen decided to sail anyway. The longer they waited, the more likely the Soviets would reach Gotenhafen. Better to risk submarines than wait for Soviet tanks. Petersen faced an impossible choice about routing. The Baltic had been swept for mines in certain shipping lanes, but those lanes were well known to Soviet submarines. He could sail in the swept channels where mines were cleared, but submarines were hunting. Or he could sail in deeper water, where submarines were less active, but mines were a constant threat. He chose to sail in the swept channel, close to shore, arguing that the torpedo boat escort could protect against submarines better than it could detect mines. But there was another problem. Germany had declared the Baltic a war zone, which meant Soviet submarines were authorized to attack any German ship without warning, and Soviet submarine commanders were under orders to sink anything that moved. The Red Army was taking revenge for German atrocities in Russia. Soviet submarine crews weren't making distinctions between military and civilian targets. A German ship was a target, period. The temperature on January 30th was below freezing. The Baltic was rough. Not stormy, but cold enough that seawater spray would freeze on contact. Most of the refugees were below decks, trying to stay warm. The ship was overloaded enough that her draft was deeper than designed, making her slower and less maneuverable. She was making about 12 knots, a careful pace given the sea conditions and the overloading. At approximately 9 p.m., the Wilhelm Gustloff was sailing off the coast of Pomerania, about 30 kilometers from shore, when Soviet submarine S-13 detected her. The submarine was commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, a skilled but troubled officer who'd been facing disciplinary action for drinking. This was his chance to redeem himself with a significant kill. Marinesko observed the Gustloff through his periscope. He saw a large ship, clearly a passenger liner, sailing with minimal escort. Under international law, attacking a clearly marked passenger ship full of civilians would be a war crime. But the Gustloff wasn't clearly marked. She'd been painted wartime gray. She had anti-aircraft guns mounted on deck, and Soviet standing orders were unambiguous. German ships in the Baltic were legitimate targets. At 9:08 p.m., Marinsko gave the order to fire. 3 torpedoes launched from S-13, targeted at the Wilhelm Gustloff's port side. Marinsko had named the torpedoes for Soviet heroes, for the motherland, for the Soviet people, and for Leningrad. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and true. The first torpedo struck near the bow, in the area that had been converted to a swimming pool and was now packed with refugees. The explosion tore through multiple decks, killing hundreds instantly. The second torpedo hit in the middle of the ship, directly in the area where the U-boat trainees were quartered. The third torpedo struck near the engine room, destroying the ship's power and propulsion. The Wilhelm Gustloff immediately began listing to port. The electrical system failed, plunging the entire ship into darkness. In the chaos, in the dark, with the ship tilting, and thousands of people screaming, any chance of organized evacuation disappeared. The refugees who'd been packed into every available space now became a death trap. People crushed in stairwells, trampled in corridors, trapped in cabins as water rushed in. The lifeboats were frozen. Even if the davits had worked, even if people could have launched the boats properly, most of them were solid blocks of ice. The few boats that were freed mostly capsized immediately when overcrowded refugees overloaded them, and the water temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. Nobody survives more than 20 minutes in water that cold. Most people died within minutes of hitting the water. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank in less than an hour. By some accounts, as quickly as 40 minutes after the torpedo strikes. For a ship that size, that's extraordinarily fast. Evidence of how catastrophic the damage was, and how badly the overloading compromised stability. As the ship rolled onto her side, people who'd been clinging to the hull slid into the freezing water. The suction of the ship going down pulled hundreds more underwater. The torpedo boat, Loa, and several other ships that had been nearby tried to rescue survivors, pulling people from the water in the darkness. But the Baltic in January is merciless. Most people in the water were already dead by the time rescuers arrived, and the rescue ships couldn't linger. They were potential targets themselves, and staying in the area meant risking more lives. The final death toll will never be known precisely. The passenger manifest was incomplete. Nobody knew exactly how many people had boarded. Estimates range from 9,000 to over 10,000 deaths. Only about 1,000 people survived. Some sources say as few as 996. The survival rate was approximately 10%. That means 90% of everyone aboard died. Mostly women and children, mostly refugees who'd been fleeing for their lives and thought they'd found safety on a ship. To put this in perspective, the Titanic's death toll was 1,517. The Lusitania, 1,198. The HMS Hood, 1,415. The Wilhelm Gustloff killed more people than all 3 of those famous disasters combined. It wasn't even close. This was the single deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. And yet, in the decades after World War II, the Wilhelm Gustloff was barely mentioned. The reasons were complicated and uncomfortable. From the German perspective, talking about German civilian suffering during the war seemed inappropriate when Germans had caused so much suffering to others. From the Soviet perspective, acknowledging that they'd sunk a ship full of refugees didn't fit the narrative of the heroic Red Army defeating fascism. And from the Allied perspective, German casualties, even civilian casualties, weren't worth documenting in detail when the focus was on Nazi atrocities and Allied victory. The few survivors rarely talked about their experiences. Those who did faced skepticism and accusations. Some people didn't believe the death toll. Others accused the survivors of being Nazi sympathizers. The Cold War made the situation worse. The wreck was in Soviet-controlled waters, and nobody in the West was allowed to investigate. The Wilhelm Gustloff became a historical footnote, mentioned occasionally in academic papers, but absent from popular consciousness. Captain Alexander Marinesko was celebrated in the Soviet Union as a hero for sinking the Gustloff. He received the Order of the Red Banner and continued serving until the end of the war, but his drinking caught up with him, and he was discharged from the Navy in 1945. He spent years working menial jobs, his heroism forgotten by the same Soviet system that had celebrated him. Only in 1990, decades after his death, was he posthumously awarded Hero of the Soviet Union. The Wilhelm Gustloff rested in the Baltic Sea at a depth of about 55 meters, in Polish territorial waters. After the war, Poland declared the wreck a war grave and prohibited diving on the site, but the location wasn't precisely documented, and for decades, the exact position remained uncertain. The Baltic is a busy shipping area, and there were concerns about unexploded ordnance and the environmental impact of a wreck that size. In the 1950s and 60s, Polish divers located the wreck but didn't publicize the discovery. The Cold War was at its height, and neither Poland nor the Soviet Union wanted attention focused on the Wilhelm Gustloff. The few mentions of the sinking in Eastern European sources characterized it as a legitimate military target, a ship full of U-boat crews and Nazi personnel. The civilian deaths were minimized or ignored. It wasn't until after the Cold War ended that serious historical investigation of the Wilhelm Gustloff became possible. In the 1990s, German historians began interviewing survivors and reconstructing what had happened. The death toll became clearer. The civilian composition of the passengers was documented, and people began asking why this disaster had been so thoroughly forgotten. In 2003, a joint German-Polish diving expedition finally documented the wreck in detail. Using underwater cameras and sonar, they mapped the Wilhelm Gustloff's position and condition. The ship lies on her starboard side in about 55 meters of water. The hull is largely intact but heavily deteriorated. The cold Baltic waters have preserved some features but corroded others. The wreck is covered in fishing nets. The Baltic is heavily fished and trawlers have snagged the wreck countless times over the decades. The dive footage showed the immense scale of the ship. The Art Deco fittings were still visible in some sections. The swimming pool where the first torpedo struck was identifiable, and throughout the wreck, divers found personal effects, shoes, suitcases, children's toys, the scattered remnants of the 9,000+ people who died there. The discovery reignited debate about the sinking. Was it a war crime or a legitimate military target? The ship was carrying military personnel and was painted in military colors, but it was primarily full of civilian refugees, including thousands of children. Under the Geneva Conventions, deliberately targeting civilians is a war crime, but those same conventions recognize that military targets can be attacked even if civilians are present. The consensus among historians is that Marinesko was following his orders and the rules of submarine warfare as they existed in 1945. Soviet submarines were authorized to attack German ships in the Baltic. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a German ship, armed with anti-aircraft guns, carrying military personnel. From Marinesko's perspective, looking through a periscope at night, she was a legitimate target. He couldn't know, and had no obligation under 1945 law, to verify how many civilians were aboard. But that legal analysis doesn't change the tragedy. Whether the sinking was technically legal or not, 9,000+ people died. Most were civilians. Most were women and children. Most were refugees fleeing a war they hadn't started. They drowned or froze to death in the Baltic because they had the misfortune of being German civilians in January 1945. The wreck remains a protected war grave. Poland has consistently prohibited salvage or unauthorized diving. In 2006, the Polish government placed additional protections on the site after reports of illegal diving and looting. The wreck is considered both a maritime grave and a site of historical significance. Over 9,000 people remain entombed in the Wilhelm Gustloff, making it one of the largest maritime war graves in existence. In recent years, there's been growing recognition of the Wilhelm Gustloff tragedy. German television produced a docudrama about the sinking. Museums in Germany have exhibits about Operation Hannibal and the refugee evacuations. Survivors and their families have held memorial services. But the Wilhelm Gustloff remains far less known than the Titanic, even though it killed 6 times as many people. Why does the Titanic capture imagination, while the Gustloff doesn't? Part of it is timing. The Titanic sank in peacetime, a civilian disaster that could be romanticized. The Gustloff sank during a brutal war, a tragedy mixed up with questions about Nazi guilt and Soviet revenge. Part of it is narrative. The Titanic has heroes and villains, a clear story. The Gustloff is complicated, uncomfortable, hard to process, and part of it is simply that the victors write history. And nobody who won World War II wanted to talk about 9,000 dead German refugees. But the people who died on the Wilhelm Gustloff deserve to be remembered. They weren't Nazi war criminals. Most weren't even Nazi party members. They were families, children, old people, wounded soldiers who just wanted to survive. They fled the Soviet advance not because they loved Hitler but because they were terrified. And they died in the freezing Baltic because they had nowhere else to go. The wreck sits in the cold, dark waters of the Baltic Sea, a monument to the greatest maritime disaster in history, and to history's selective memory. Over 9,000 people are still down there, frozen in time, victims of a tragedy that the world chose to forget because it was politically inconvenient to remember. 55 meters down. The Wilhelm Gustloff waits, the ship that killed 6 times more people than the Titanic. The disaster that should be as famous as any shipwreck in history, but has been erased from collective memory because the victims were on the wrong side. Their deaths matter. Their story deserves to be told. And the wreck in the Baltic stands as evidence that history isn't just written by victors, it's edited by them too.